Divas, I am so excited to introduce a new guest to you this week, disability advocate Olivia Keller. She's here to talk about all things ADA and her work advocating for people with disabilities. And also, she's a plaintiff in a lawsuit I wrote about recently, and we'll talk about that lawsuit and why disabled parking permits really matter for people like her. So please help me welcome to the show Olivia Keller.
In the Americans with Disabilities Act, there is no comprehensive list of qualifying disabilities
Right.
on functional limitation. So you could have two people with cerebral palsy. One person you may not be able to tell at all and they don't need accommodations, whereas someone else may need 24/7 care and they're in a wheelchair.
You're listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida. Let's dive in.
Divas, I am so excited to have our special guest with me today, virtually. She's with me virtually. And I have been trying for years to get you on the podcast. Olivia Keller, since I first started, her name changed. Olivia Keller, disability advocate. She is a fierce advocate for people with disabilities. Welcome to Deeper Dive.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to finally be here.
Right. I mean, just wondering a little bit about your journey. You've been advocating for people with disabilities for many years, and you were a very familiar sight in the state capitol. You worked for Disability Rights Florida. People saw you zipping around in the Capitol for years. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Sure. So disability advocacy is just something I think I fell into. When I was growing up, to date myself a lot, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act had just passed a few years earlier. So I was one of the first group of students with disabilities that was actually going into the public school system instead of one of the what they called center schools. So those are buildings where, it was an entirely different school for people with disabilities. It was used more as babysitting than really.
Right.
So we had some school board fights growing up. So watching kind of my grandparents fight for me, and just friends that I had made during school of, well, why can't she, be permitted to do the same things we can? And, kind of after all of those fights and just seeing, there are other people besides me who are affected by this. And I just kind of stumbled into it after that. I majored in history and political science in college. I worked on some campaigns. I ran for office for myself in 2018.
I don't think I knew that.
Really? Yeah, I ran actually against Joe Gruters in 2018.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, that took some big balls.
Yeah, and we really had a decent relationship. Like, our campaign was not nasty,
Right.
like throwing insults at each other. I kind of wanted to prove that someone with a disability could be a viable candidate. And at that point, I had worked basically in every capacity there was on a campaign. So, okay, well, nobody's running against him. Why don't I do this?
Interesting.
And that's kind of how I ended up at Disability Rights Florida, was just the way I ran the campaign and making kind of disability a center of it instead of a kind of separate platform issue. It was, this spans every issue. So I've worked on bills, from environmental bills on straw bans to healthcare to housing, mental health, you name it. So, all of these issues touch on disability in some capacity. And so
Right.
I had people that would come up to me after debates and say, thank you for that. And, they would have invisible disabilities. And just because of the stigma associated with disability, like even some of their close friends didn't even know about their diagnoses.
Interesting.
So really to kind of give a face to the disability community that we are your constituents too. We have zero representation at really any level of government. And so I wanted to provide a voice for that. And if it wasn't in the Senate, well, then, I did it through policy work and doing lobbying.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that with me. I have type 1 diabetes, which I believe is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act in some ways. And so it is like living with an invisible disability. People don't understand when you have to have something to eat. I because it's all about me, 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 Olivia. You may have forgotten that, but let me just make it all about me, me, me. But I had a hell of a fight get for years trying to get my cell phone into the federal courthouse because I use a continuous glucose monitor and I have zero symptoms of hypoglycemia and I can go into a coma like that, and I need my phone to alert me when I need to have a snack. I mean, it's just that is long-term time anyway. So I finally was able, for years there was a clerk there that would not let me bring it in, and I got my doctor to write a letter, and I thought about suing, and then I didn't. As a reporter, you don't want to make the story about you. But anyway, then a new chief judge took over, and one day he said you can bring it in if a judge. And the reason I'm giving this long story is because this is just me with something that is, it's not a competition, but it is an example of the kind of hurdles that you have to face. So
Yes.
right, and so the judge actually said you can bring your phone in. You have to get permission from the other judges, and there were a bunch of hearings, and I was calling every other day, like I can bring my phone in, can bring my phone in, and I went into the security one day and I had my phone and I said, and they said, oh, yeah, the clerk entered an order. The clerk of the federal court in the Northern District of Florida entered an order allowing me to bring my cell phone in. And I thought, really, it should not be this hard. I should not have to get a special order from the clerk, which I'm very grateful for. But anyway, it's just a little example, and we can take it out if it seems like it's not relevant to what we're dealing with here. But
I think it is because, people look at accommodations as if there's some type of special treatment, and
yeah.
we have that ingrained in us as a society. So when I was growing up, in high school, I would refuse accommodations that I was eligible for just because other students would look at it like it wasn't fair. And so I missed the Bright Future Scholarship by 1 point on my ACT when I took it.
Oh,
And that was partially because I didn't take the extra time that I was allowed to.
oh,
So I
wow.
didn't finish sections of the test that if I would have finished, I may have gotten that. And so it sounds like such a simple thing, but that's one of those things that
Well,
can change your life trajectory.
absolutely. And maybe, for our listeners who don't know you, maybe as part of the explanation for how that might have helped you, you can tell us a little bit about your disabilities, the disabilities that you live with.
So I was born without arms. So mine was congenital. I also have mild scoliosis, and then I have a leg length discrepancy for my right leg. So that means my right leg was shorter than my left one. It didn't grow at the same rate. And so, it was a significant difference, like 6 inches, which is a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So I underwent a lot of surgeries when I was younger and had complications because of those surgeries. And so I do use the power chair because of that primarily. But what I discovered when I started using the power chair of it was so much easier to navigate the world when I wasn't walking on my hands. Because I have compartments in the chair. I have a cup holder I can stick my phone in if I want to. And so I didn't have to worry about, okay, how do I carry my purse and make sure I can reach the things in it and have to deal with doors? And it made all of that so much easier.
Right.
But nowhere in my life, because, I don't necessarily write as fast as someone else. So it takes me a little longer to bubble in bubbles.
Sure.
I'm assuming we still use Scantrons. I don't know. I'm
I
in some.
have no idea. I'm so old. I can't even, I can't remember what they do, but it would have taken you more time to do it however you were doing. And that's why I asked you to
and
explain.
and nothing in my life has depended on how fast I can fill in a bubble.
Right.
So, it was such a stupid thing at the time that
Yeah.
why didn't I do that looking back? But it's because it was ingrained in me that this is special treatment. And a lot of people with disabilities, whether they're acquired or were born with them, we experience a lot of internalized ableism because we're receiving the same messaging everyone else is. So we internalize
And
that
so
this is special treatment and we shouldn't be asking for things. And is it
because you
really?
don't deserve it or because you want to feel like you're more, part like you're more like everyone else? I mean, I'm just wondering where that comes from.
It's more from, the look of, well, that's not fair, so why should
Yeah.
she get extra time? She's in all the same classes, I
Right.
am, and, we're doesn't get special treatment there.
Yeah. It's so
So there's
interesting that you say the internalizing ableism because you how can you not? It's just like being a woman, you internalize all these things that I'm teaching all the my Girl Scouts years ago. You don't have to be slim and conventionally attractive and all these other things to be successful and love yourself. And yet that's the message that I'm constantly, even as an old lady now, still struggling with internally, right?
Well, people think that, accommodations are something that we're just handed. In the Americans with Disabilities Act, there is no comprehensive list of qualifying disabilities. It's
Right.
based on functional limitation. So you could have two people with cerebral palsy that are impacted very, very differently.
Mm,
One person you may not be able to tell at all, and they don't need accommodations, whereas someone else may need 24/7 care and they're in a wheelchair. So there's such a drastic difference that we can't just say X disability or X condition is a disability. And a lot of the confusion with that is the way we use the term disability.
right.
Impairment and disability are not the same thing, but we tend to use them interchangeably. So, for example, I was born without arms. But in my house, everything is set up so I can function. I'm not really disabled in my house. It's when I go out into the rest of the world and if there isn't parking for me, if there isn't a curb cut, if there isn't a ramp, if there isn't an automatic door, those are the things that are disabling. It's not necessarily my impairment. It's when my impairment interacts in a world that was not designed for me to fit into it. And so that's the distinction. And I think that's the point that a lot of people lose of it's not about the condition, the impairment, the diagnosis. It's about the ways in which it interacts with your environment,
Right.
limits your ability to do things.
We'll be right back with Olivia Keller. And now I'd like to tell you all about an upcoming event sponsored by the News Service of Florida. Florida is aging fast, and solutions can't wait. On Wednesday, November 19th, the News Service is hosting the Florida Aging Summit at the Doubletree Tallahassee on Adams Street. Michelle Branham, Secretary of the Florida Department of Elder Affairs, as well as leaders from the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration, the Florida Senate, and multiple area agencies on aging will be tackling caregiving, healthy aging, housing, and workforce issues. It's practical, it's nonpartisan, and it's built for action. Seats are limited. To learn more, go to newsserviceflorida.com and click on the Events tab. That's the Florida Aging Summit on November 19th at the Doubletree Tallahassee on Adams Street. See you there. Divas, you know what time it is. It's time for the News in Haikus. The News in Haikus. This week's haiku was contributed by our guest, Olivia Keller. Disabled parking. Expectant mothers don't need. Save for those who do. The News in Haikus. That's the News in Haikus. Don't forget, we'd love to hear your haiku. You can slide them into my DMs or you can send them to podcasts, that's podcasts with an S, at e.newsserviceflorida.com. Wherever you're listening, please don't forget to subscribe and give us a rating if you like what we're doing. And we're back with Olivia Keller. I wanted to talk about language, first of all, and there's a lot of, there's terms that we don't use anymore that people still use, and I don't know that they understand just sort of the inappropriateness of them. But I also appreciate you pointing out the difference between the disability and the impairment. And you and I were talking the other day and you said something about like, you're not disabled in your house. That made me, it was kind of an eye opener for me. So I do want to invite you to correct me whenever I say something or use language that could be worded more appropriately or better. So please do that. And while we're on that topic, how important is it for you and other people that the language shows respect for people with disabilities?
I think the fact that people don't use the appropriate terms that disabled people actually chose for themselves just really displays the lack of knowledge and the lack of consideration and, the low priority that the disability community is. People still use the term handicapped and they'll say handicap parking, but that's not what it's called anymore. And it hasn't been called that in a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
The Americans with Disabilities Act was written primarily by disabled people, and that was the terminology that they chose, was people with disabilities or disabled. You can use one. A lot of people with disabilities, we use them interchangeably, like I just did there.
Right.
But some variation of that, most people will be happy with, as long as you're not calling them, crippled or handicapped or, these terms that were outdated 40, 50 years ago,
Right.
but people still continue to use and almost like insert back into our vernacular when it just needs to go away.
Right. And when you think about, if you were using a racial epithet or something like that, it would really, I don't know how long it took for people to get that's we don't do that anymore. So I don't know why it seems like such a stumbling block in this regard, but I guess, you were talking, and we'll talk more about that, about how you feel like disabled people aren't even on the, like, included in the dialogue at all.
It's weird to me that people don't understand that, well, no, it's not the same identically to racism or sexism or ableism is still an ism and is just as impactful. These are parallel paths that we have traveled, and the root of all of it is the same. So why is disability seem to be this bridge too far where, everyone's going to be, oh my God, offended about any other community. But then
Right.
when it comes to us, it's like, oh, well, just
Get
deal,
over it.
just
Right.
get over it, or,
Yeah.
and it's not that important. Well, yeah, it is.
It's words matter.
Yes.
You're a plaintiff in a federal lawsuit. This is one of the reasons why we've been chatting this week, and I'd like to talk about this. You're a plaintiff in a federal lawsuit challenging a 2025 law that somehow was not on my radar screen at all. It allows pregnant women to get disabled parking permits. I wrote about that issue this week, and I just find it so compelling on so many levels. Um, again, because it's all about me, me, me. I fractured my tibia a couple years ago, and I was using a wheelchair. And I can tell you that, and I had trouble walking for almost a year, and I still do, but I have a tiny understanding about the significance of parking for disabled people, the significance of those spaces. And your lawsuit alleges that these parking spaces for pregnant women, which come out of the same pool of parking spaces that are allocated for disabled people, that it violates the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act. And I was wondering, like, why don't you start by telling our divas about this lawsuit and why you decided to file it?
Sure. I mean, I wish I would have known about this bill when it was making its way through session. I work more at a federal level now. While I do some state work, it's one or two bills across 20 states that I'm reading 20 different versions of. And I don't have the capacity as a human being to monitor 200 bills in 50 different states. It's not possible. So, no one flagged it for me or apparently anyone. And this just kind of skated on through. So I actually found out about it through my work. I was in a national coalition meeting and someone mentioned it. I was like, what are you talking? What happened?
In your
And so
home state.
yes, in my home state. And so I went back and looked and I was just like, how did this
Well,
pass?
it was, excuse me, I interrupt. It's how I communicate. So please don't be offended but interrupt back. But it was, in the way I wrote about it, it was tucked into a sweeping transportation package. So it wasn't a standalone bill. And I think you told me it was included in the House bill all along, and then it was added into the final bill. So, but it wasn't just a bill on its own. So I think we can all maybe be forgiven for having missed it, but it is what it is.
In the Senate, I will give grace to the Senate
Right.
because that provision was not in the Senate bill for any of its
I
committee
got
stuff.
you. Okay.
It was added as a floor amendment. So there's no way to go give public testimony on a floor amendment. Like
Right.
it's too late at that point.
Yep.
However, like you said, it was in the original House version. And so once I found out about this, of course, I go and start looking everything up. And in the first committee stop, Representative McFarland was the one who filed it. And I mean, she talks about it
Yeah.
a lot, and that's her favorite part of the bill. And another representative in the committee asked her, are you creating separate spaces? Are there going to be separate tags? And her response was that she's been out before and seen
I mean,
parking.
I'm just going to read what I quoted from what she said, and you include these comments in the lawsuit. They are quoted, and I want to say that you're represented by Matthew Dietz with the Nova University. It's got a long name, but Clinic for. We'll get to that before I end, but she said that Representative Fiona McFarland is a Sarasota Republican, also Sarasota. She said that she thought about this when she was 9 months pregnant, and as she waddled, that's her word, across a parking lot in September, and she saw all these vacant, quote, handicap spots. And rather than complain about a problem without a solution, I realized that I had it within my power to help women like me not have to walk uncomfortably for such a long distance. Then she was asked about it, and she said, was it a disability? And she said, I mean, I feel very strongly that pregnancy is not a disability. I just want to be able to park up front. And she said that maybe it sounds a little harsher than how she said it, because she said it kind of, and she was grinning when she said it, and maybe she was trying to be
She said
funny.
it in a way that, she thought was funny,
Yeah.
and apparently most people in the room thought was
Yeah,
funny.
there was a giggles.
Yeah, and I want to give credit to Representative Skidmore for being the only person in the room that did not think that was funny, because I don't think it's funny. I thought it was incredibly offensive that you're talking about disabled parking, and it is disabled parking. That is what it's called. That's what
Right.
it's called in the ADA. That is what it's called in state statute. If you read the sign, it says parking by disabled permit only.
Right.
It's 5 words. Read it. But
Right.
number one, you're not using the correct terminology to refer to my community. But there was no discussion about the needs of disabled people in a conversation about disabled parking. And that part just kind of blew my mind
Yeah.
of, maybe you should talk to the people whose lives you're about to impact.
Where are those spaces coming from? So there's a finite number of disabled parking spaces, and and in the lawsuit it lays it all out. And I just got to tell you, I think people are under the misapprehension that there's all these extra spaces, and there really aren't. And you talked about your experience in Tallahassee. I tell you my experience when I needed it, driving around, not being able to find a spot near the Capitol. There's a very few number of spaces. Tell us about you personally, why you need this space, and what your experience is trying to find one.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, there are a finite number of spaces. The bill in no way increased the number of
Right.
spaces, in no way decreased the need of disabled people to use them, but then it increased the number of people who are eligible to park there.
So it exacerbates the problem.
Right. And she'll state that her intention was not to harm disabled people, although that's not how we were referred to.
Right.
I mean, that's not deep policy research. That's math. If you are adding people to something that is in a finite supply, then obviously you are taking away from the people who need to park there. But the way she was joking about it in committee, it's that same, it brings me back to high school of, that's not fair that you get the special spot. And, the ADA was passed, and disabled parking was actually one of the very first disability accommodations with curb cuts, that actually Delaware started in 1955. And
Wow.
then we had the Architectural Barriers Act in 1968, which made them national. There's just no enforcement. There's arguably not a whole lot of enforcement now, which is another part of the problem. But, this was done to allow people with disabilities to enter the workforce, to become economically self-sufficient and less reliant on government programs, and to be able to spend disposable money in their communities. And so that's how a lot of us
To live, I mean, basically, I
to be
was,
a person.
yeah,
This
I mean,
allows me
I
to
was
be a
writing
person.
this, and I was saying, I think in my story I was kind of struggling, because I was saying, it's designed to,
Right.
are needed to uh,
Right. It's not
to go
from
to
my
school, to go to the market, to go to and then I was thinking, well, what doesn't you need it to do anything outside your home,
right.
really?
And that was the intent, was for us to be people like everyone else and to be able to live a fairly normative life. It's not special treatment, it's not for our convenience, it's not necessarily to make our lives easier, it's to make our lives possible. So I have a van that has a ramp that deploys off the side, and I get my power chair off of the ramp. That requires a minimum of 8 feet of clearance. So if I cannot park in a parking space that has access to the access aisle, so that's the little striped space that you'll see next to a lot of disabled parking spaces, I need that to be able to get out of my car. If I can't park there, I'm trapped in my car. I can't go do the things I need to do.
And oh, by the
So
way, let me just interrupt you again here, because people might not know this, or you may have noticed it and forgotten about it, but there are fewer of those spots than
yes.
there are of disabled parking permit spots altogether. So they're a commodity.
Yeah, and at most, they make up 1% of parking. If
Mm-hmm.
you're looking at a large lot, like 500 spaces, I have access to 2 of those that have to be van accessible.
Mm.
If I'm lucky, I have 4 because sometimes I put the access aisle in between spots. And if I'm really, really lucky, I have 6. But that's out of a parking lot of 500 spaces. This is
Right.
not a lot that I have, access to. And so while she's talking about being hot and uncomfortable, okay, well, you still got into the store, okay, and were able to do the things you need to do. So if you are able to park somewhere else and still go about your day, then you do not need to park there.
Right.
And a lot of people with disabilities who would benefit from parking there, who do struggle, that this would make their life easier, don't qualify because we have to meet really strict requirements. So in order to get disabled parking, and even though my disability is not going to go away, I'm not going to suddenly sprout arms and my knee's not going to fix itself. Like, these are things that are not going to happen, but I still have to go renew it every couple of years, even with a permanent one. And so I have to take the form to my doctor, who has to certify that either you are legally blind, that you are a full-time wheelchair user, or you have a condition that limits your mobility to the point where you can only walk, not more than 200 feet without resting. If we don't meet those requirements, we don't qualify. So what she has done is created a double standard for disabled parking, where the standard for disabled people is now higher to get disabled parking than someone who is pregnant, who just has to take the form to their doctor and they check a box saying, yes, this person is pregnant. There's no mobility restriction.
Huh.
So we should all have to meet the same standard if we're going to all share the same parking space. And so someone that has a complicated pregnancy that really does limit their mobility, they have always been able to get a temporary disabled parking placard. This is not who this is for. That's always been the case. This is just you tested pregnant on a pregnancy test. You go to your doctor, they confirm that. And it doesn't matter if you're 6 weeks pregnant and you can run a marathon.
Right.
Here's your disabled parking placard that you get to keep for a year.
Yeah.
Or you can be on the other end of it and get it at like 8.5 months pregnant. And then you have it for the first year almost of your child's life when you're
Yeah,
not
yeah, that
pregnant.
was what kind of, I mean, all of this really, I have to say, kind of blew me away. Maybe I don't know if, this is an issue that I've cared about, disability rights, for many years. Um, Hence me trying to get you on the podcast for since we started, but just, and maybe because of my own experience, realizing how inaccessible the Capitol is, and not just the Capitol, and then Publix, and going out to lunch, and like literally having to have people carry me into a meeting that I was podcasting from, and all of the ick that goes along with that. And so it just, maybe I'm a little bit more cognizant of it than I might have been without that experience. But I do want to also mention that these are numbers that I got from the lawsuit, or that you have in the lawsuit, that 1.3 million of the state's 18.5 million drivers, or about 7%, have permanent parking permits because of a disability. That doesn't include temporary permits. And so the temporary permits you can get, I think they're only good for 6 months unless you're a pregnant woman, which it's also called the expectant mother parking thing, which I thought was kind of, it made me feel like it's a throwback to the Victorian era, but okay. And the number of parking spaces that are required to be reserved for disabled parking ranges from about 2% to 4%. I think it's mostly around the 2%. And then
Yeah, it
depending on,
generally tends to be closer to the 2%.
yeah. And then there's,
Medical
yeah,
facilities and places are required to have a few more, but
right.
still not enough. Like I went to a doctor's appointment a couple of weeks ago at the Tallahassee Memorial Hospital complex. It was at 8 a.m. when I got there, and the all the disabled parking
Wow.
spaces, parking garage were full at 8 a.m.
Wow.
They actually had separate expectant mother parking, and there were more of those spaces than there were the disabled parking
Wow.
spaces, but half of those were empty, whereas the spaces that I need to park in were already full.
Uh,
Unfortunately, someone just happened to be leaving, but are to say that based on one experience that, there's plenty of spaces because you've seen them open, the traffic on the interstate isn't the same at 3 a.m.
yeah,
as it is at 5 p.m. on a
true.
Tuesday afternoon. Like these are not comparable.
Yeah.
You're not getting the full scope. Like basically, the best comparable I can give people is that finding parking for me is like trying to find parking at 10 a.m. on Black Friday.
Oh
Like
gosh.
my everyday.
That's a
Um,
great analogy. I mean,
and
that
we've
is
been
really
trying.
good, right? People can
We have to
identify to
build
that.
in hours into our day. Like I said, I have had to get to the Capitol at 7:30 in the morning. If even I only needed to be in committee at 10 a.m. because if I wasn't there by 7:30, I wasn't going to find a parking space. And
That's
I have
right.
literally circled the Capitol complex for over half an hour before
Yeah.
looking for parking.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't have to build an extra 4 hours into my day just to try to find a parking space to go about my life.
Yeah, and I think like the reason that I rattled off those numbers is because we already have probably less than half the number of spaces that, I mean, that's not even including the temporary ones. And the idea, I mean, I don't want to, so you could get this, and it lasts for a year, the expectant mother parking permit. It lasts for a year, so you can be 9, 10 months past your pregnancy and after giving birth and still have access to these spots. It just really must fry you to think about that.
It does. Like, I understand that it's a lot to deal with an infant and a car seat and a stroller and a diaper bag. But there are also women with disabilities who are pregnant too and have children. And so they have to deal with all those things plus a wheelchair and finding parking. And so, number one, it's completely not even considering the fact that it's that idea that we're all perpetually 12 and asexual, but there are people with disabilities. I'm married that have children. I have a bunch of friends that actually have the various disabilities that either have a child under the age of 1 or are currently
Right.
pregnant. So those they need those spots too. And so it is sending the message that your time and your life is more valuable than mine. That I don't have anything important to do and that I can just wait for you to finish your grocery shopping and get out of the space so I can use it to do the things that I need to do. And that's really insulting. And I mean, that's the message that is being sent here. It's special treatment, it's convenience. You don't really need it, and you can just wait until, I'm done, and then I will free up the space that was originally designated for you, in order for you to be able to go about your day.
And maybe I need to mention here, in case divas don't know, that pregnancy is not a disability that is covered under the ADA,
No,
or
there
a
are,
condition, not a condition, or impairment, that this is the word you use. It's not an
right,
impairment that's covered under the ADA.
because pregnancy in itself does not cause functional limitations.
Right.
Well, no, it is not.
I don't know. I mean, I think we all think that walking, when you're pregnant and for little kids and all, is supposed to be healthy, but I'm not trying to be snarky. I do think you also came up with a suggestion, I think, that was, they could have just passed a law that just requires businesses and governments, agencies, to set aside parking spots for pregnant women. I actually, as I was doing a little research on this, because you did tell me that it's being advertised or highlighted on on websites for like the uh
Tax collectors' offices,
tax
yeah.
collectors. Thank you. Tax collectors. I was scrolling through my story, the tax collectors, and also on the Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles. That's the defendant, and they are the ones that issue the permits. But I looked at the Miami-Dade County website, and it says, talk to your physician to get started and make parking a little easier during your pregnancy, exclamation point. And I don't know. It's like, in a way, I guess, like, we're talking about the lawsuit and the parking issue. You've been an advocate for years, living with disabilities since you were born. I mean, does the kind of the tone deafness and the obliviousness, does that, like, it strikes me, is it like surprising to you that in 2025 you're seeing this?
It really is, especially when I was at the Capitol for 6
I know.
sessions
I
and a
know.
lot of committee meetings and met with a lot of members, including Representative McFarland. And so the fact that I never crossed your mind, even if you don't remember my name, that, hey, remember the lady that was here all the time that used a wheelchair? Maybe she needs to park there. And even people with disabilities, like, I can walk short distances. So sometimes we will go with my husband somewhere and we'll take his car, and I have a little folding power chair that does fit in the trunk. But if we're able to park somewhere that isn't the disabled
Sure.
parking space and I don't need to park there, then I will leave it for someone else who I know may need it more than I do.
Right.
So, I mean, not everybody does that, but a lot of people within the disability community do that as a consideration because we understand the struggles of other disabled people.
Yeah.
So the fact that other people who don't have disabilities are thinking that, their inconveniences are comparable to what we deal with, it's not,
I
and it
mean,
shows
maybe
a
we
lack
can
of
hope.
understanding.
Yeah, a lack of understanding, and maybe just a lack of education, that there are not, these spots are coveted and highly sought after, and there are inadequate number of them. I mean, I think that is like the number one thing that I'm hoping people understand, because,
I
and
want them to understand the inequality of this too, with the
okay, well,
that was
yes,
created
I do
with,
too. I do
yeah,
too.
where I have to check all these boxes to park there, but you just have to be pregnant. Like,
Also,
that's not disabled parking anymore.
yeah, and also they thank you, and also the process to get that. All you
Mhm.
need is a letter confirming from your doctor confirming that you're pregnant. It's much more onerous on to get a disabled parking permit if you truly are disabled. So there's another double standard there too.
And for me, my disability is visible, although, as you described earlier, the process we have to go through accommodations is arduous and, documentation is needed a lot of the time. I'm like, really? Really, you need documentation for
Right.
my disability as I'm
Right.
sitting without arms and with scars on my leg from surgery and in my power chair? But accommodations, like this is one of the few that are like specifically mandated accommodations. Most accommodations are a negotiation process. It's not something that we get to go demand from our employer that, hey, I need this. The employer can push back and say, oh, no, that's not feasible for us. So, you kind of negotiate back and forth on this. And I think a good example of this was remote work. Disabled people have been fighting for work from home, remote work forever, partially because of transportation issues. We don't
Mm-hmm.
have great public transit. If you can't drive, God help you, you can't cross county lines half the time.
Mm-hmm.
So having remote employment is very
Especially in
beneficial.
Florida, we are a state that you really need a car
We do.
to get wherever you need to go.
And
In
I mean,
most
that's part of the
places.
problem too of accommodation in the capital of I live in Tallahassee. I have the benefit of being able to drive, but somebody in Miami who can't drive
Mm-hmm.
can't go into a committee room and give testimony. So they don't have that same exposure
Mm-hmm.
and access to their representatives. But with the remote work,
Yes.
once COVID hit and everybody needed it, well, then it was a great accommodation for everyone. And now that we're saying, COVID's over and everybody goes back to normal, now disabled people are having to fight for that accommodation again. And
Oh,
it's like, it
really?
was fine for everybody else, but when we need it as an accommodation, oh no, no, that's a step too far.
How's that going? I mean, are you fighting this battle in many states? Because I know that in Florida, this is one of the like yeah, everybody needs to go to the office, and we don't want state workers working from home. So, what's the status of that?
That I'm not really sure. With the individuals I work with, we haven't gotten a whole lot of that, but my
Okay,
population tends to skew a little older, so a lot of
right.
them just are retired. But I do have friends that even live in other states or who were government workers or are government workers that are going. And this is
Yeah.
the only way it can work. Like one of the weird things about COVID was that was the first noticeable increase in employment among people with disabilities, and it hit its highest
Uh,
level ever when we gave that accommodation. And so now that, that's being reined in, we are seeing employment numbers for people with disabilities drop.
oh
So,
wow.
these accommodations are needed for us to do our jobs. And so, most people think of parking as this simple little thing
Mm-hmm.
that you get to take for granted, but like it can upend our lives. It can cost someone their job. And then that person's going to be blamed for not trying hard enough, not because the state took away their tool that they were using in order to function in their life.
I want to before we move on to some of the other things I want to talk about. I was wondering, is this pregnant parking permit? Oh, I was when I was doing the research with the Miami-Dade County thing, I saw they actually have special like strollers. Some places have special parking spots, like local ordinances that they've passed for people with strollers. So you have to set aside some spots for them. I was wondering if this pregnant parking permit is something that you've seen in other states, or is Florida the only state with
Oh,
this?
I wish Florida was the only state. So Florida got the idea from Illinois. I think it was a combo of saw that Illinois did it and went, oh, hey, I'm pregnant. That would be really awesome for me.
I
And
see.
I want to, expand that. So the Illinois one does have some restrictions. So people do have to be, at their third trimester. They can't keep it as long, but it's still there. New Mexico had a bill their last session that failed. But Ohio has now taken the Florida bill. And whereas, ours was tucked into an omnibus transportation
Mm-hmm.
bill, theirs is a standalone. And so Ohio is now seeing what's happening in Florida. And, that was part of my motivation too, of if this was just about me, I may not have gone through all this effort, but as you saw in the litigation, we're talking about 1 million+ people just in Florida whose lives can be impacted by this. Well, great. Now we're contagious, and Ohio is looking at the same thing.
Right.
So, we're kind of this virus that I'm trying to stop before it becomes a more systemic issue.
Yeah.
Because God forbid California or Texas, were to do this too. Like, we're impacting the lives of just millions of disabled people across the country.
Sure. That leads me to your advocacy, and this is you're doing this legally. Can you give me an example, a specific story about a key legislative battle that you had in Tallahassee where your advocacy work made a tangible difference?
I mean, I think there were a few things that we managed to do. One of the things that I was always, always, always pushing back on were registry bills. So everybody wants to wrap disabled people in bubble wrap and protect us from ourselves and, treat us like we're all the same. And we need that. And granted, there are some people that do need more protection than others, but creating police registries. So if you had someone who is autistic and, wandered and, it was meant for those purposes, or if you get pulled over, the officer knows that you have a disability ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
But anecdotal evidence shows that even when officers know you have a disability ahead of time, it doesn't matter because they haven't had the proper training to say that someone is autistic. If they have, their only experience with someone with autism is their 3-year-old nephew who kicks and bites and punches people, that's their idea of what autism is. So if someone calls law enforcement for assistance with their, teenage son that is also autistic and is, 6 feet tall, they are transferring their idea of autism onto that individual. And they're going to treat that individual as they would their 3-year-old nephew who they're afraid is
Oh,
going to
right.
attack.
Right.
So it can create a more dangerous situation, and we have seen across the country. There was a really famous case, and I'm drawing a blank on what state it was, but there was a young man with Down syndrome who was in a movie theater, and he was with his support person, and he wanted to stay and watch the movie again because he really liked the movie. And so the manager came in and she told him, just give me a minute. We'll get him out, but I, don't and they just kept interfering, and then they called law enforcement,
Oh,
and the law enforcement officers knew him. Like, he was just enamored by law enforcement, and he would call 911 just to get police officers to
uh,
the lights. And so
right.
his mom took him to the police station and made sure people knew who he was. And, you know, law enforcement kind of paraded him around, I guess, and, let him hang out with them. And some of the officers responsible for this actually knew him. The support person told the officers, do not touch him. If you touch him, he's gonna, freak out. And they didn't listen. So they grab him, put him down on the ground, and, are kneeling on top of him. Now, people with Down syndrome tend to have heart problems and respiratory issues. And this young man died
Ugh.
because he wanted to watch a movie a second time. And so, I was constantly fighting registry bills, which some of them we couldn't stop, but at least got them in a tamer version that hopefully won't do as
Yeah.
much harm. There were a couple bills of, there was a push that I was able to help stop with a plan to change the iBudget waiver, the
Oh
name of it,
gosh.
to the waiver for persons with unique abilities. And this was a Casey DeSantis word. And before this happened, there was a press conference she was in, and we counted, and I can't remember how many times she said it in this like 15-minute press conference, but it was like 30 times. And like almost like a forced effort of trying to say unique abilities instead of saying disability. And people with disabilities hated it, because we're like, it makes
I
it sound
remember
like
that,
we're
and I
5
remember.
years old and, we should be flying around with a cape. Like, no,
No, I
let's take
remember
something
thinking,
seriously.
what is this? Like, is it? I actually went and Googled and I thought, well, maybe there's a new, like, they've changed the terminology and I didn't know and I didn't get the memo. And I thought, this is just, it was really stood out to me, that unique abilities thing.
Yeah, so we met, I met with bill sponsors and we managed to kind of hit it off at the pass before you made it into bill. And then they tried to circumvent work that we had done. And, they have to renew their waiver application every so often. And in the renewal, they had requested the change. So people started posting public comments, and it got an absurd number of public comments for something that is a state agency renewal process for a
Right.
program. And it just quietly disappeared and no one said it anymore at the Capitol. So that is probably, that language thing.
Right.
One of my proudest moments. I was also DeSantis's first veto. So I do have that honor. So my very first session after I just run for office, I actually worked with Joe Gruters, and we made it onto the front of the Sarasota Herald Tribune because we're working together. So basically, I turned something that had been a straw ban into a ban on straw bans, and there was a lot of legislative gymnastics that happened with this, and we were fighting for an OPAGA study, to see the impact of this on people with disabilities, because I don't have hands. Like, I can't pick up a glass unless it has a handle. And then it depends on how heavy and full, and, but when you're using a straw, try drinking, coffee out of a paper straw, or one that you have to carry around and you can't necessarily clean it. So if you have coffee in the morning, everything you drink thereafter tastes like coffee.
I know.
And that's not practical for a lot of people. Like, we
Right.
need plastic straws. We do.
Yes.
And so, we got it passed. It was a weird situation for me because here I am. I just ran against Joe Gruters, and
Right.
now I'm on the side with like the restaurant and lodging and retail association and petroleum, and the Republicans and the Democrats and environmentalists that had endorsed me were now like attacking me
Oh
and
my gosh.
making life decisions. But it basically goes to show that, when I was at the Capitol, and I would tell people I am probably the most purple person in the building.
I remember you telling me that
I'm
before.
looking at both sides and I'm like, no, you're both doing it wrong, just in very, very different ways. In some regards, I almost have more respect for the people who will admittedly just flat out say they don't care versus the people who pretend to and then do nothing.
Okay, so
But
wait, you got the bill, you wanted the veto or you wanted the
no, we
bill?
we wanted it to pass because we managed to turn the ban into a ban on straw bans. So
Okay,
it's like
right,
a
right,
ban
right,
ban.
right. Oh, no, I
Um,
remember when he vetoed that, he said it should be left up to local communities.
He said that you should elect someone who would do this. So it was kind of like a jab at me, is the way it came across, which I don't know if do I take that as an
No,
honor?
I think maybe Gruters. I mean, don't they have a long running? I mean,
So I don't know. But I mean, he wasn't actually on the bill. He was just actually chairing the first committee it went through,
oh.
connected me with the bill sponsor, and it kind of took off from there. But
All right, so you were DeSantis's first veto?
I was
Oh,
DeSantis'
wait,
first.
I meant to do this. There you go. Your badge of honor.
Yep, it's my badge of honor. But I mean, people have been mad at me on both sides of the aisle. People have appreciated my support on both sides of the aisle. I ran as a Democrat. I don't really consider myself either, just because I consider myself a disability advocate. I speak for my community, and I will work with whoever is willing to help us to help ourselves.
Let me,
So that's why this made me so mad because it
yeah,
took away the tool that I'm using to help myself.
yeah, right. Being able to get out of the house. Not out of the house, but you know what I mean. Get where you want to go. Before we have a couple of fun questions, beyond physical access, what systemic barriers? I have a couple more serious. What systemic barriers, such employment, healthcare, education, do you believe require the most urgent attention and reform?
I mean, education, I think, is a big one. Um, with the voucher programs, and on the one hand, I do get it because I've spoken to parents who have children in the public school system and they're not receiving the services that they need. And they're frustrated, and so they will pull them out and put them in a school that they think, and maybe it does. I mean, not all schools that receive vouchers are bad. I'm not going to paint them all with the same brushstroke,
Mm-hmm.
but it's creating cinder schools all over again
Mm,
because most of them are strictly for people with autism or, whatever disability. And so it's segregating students again. We're pulling funding out of the schools that, people need for accommodations within the school system. um, when we kind of look at the scapegoating of people with mental health conditions for violence, when that's actually quite the opposite. Now students are afraid to come forward when they need help, because we kind of stigmatized mental illness so much. So I think those are some of the big challenges. A lot of it is also just the way that the laws were put together to begin with. So, the only way to address like what I'm doing right now is through someone coming forward and filing litigation.
yeah.
You can file Department of Justice complaints, but who's that going to go to now? And even, under previous administrations, under Biden, under Obama, like this is across the board. I'm not picking on anyone. Half the time you would wait a year to hear
Yeah.
anything back. And most of the time it was dismissed and they'll say, oh no, we're not going to do anything for you. The vast majority of the disability community lives at or below the poverty line, so they're not going to be paying an attorney out of pocket. So if it weren't for, Matt's clinic, then I don't know how I would be addressing this. Whereas, I do work. We're a two-income household. I'm solidly middle class, but I'm not going to be a millionaire anytime soon. And so to take on, a city or a state
Yeah.
when they're violating the laws that protect you, most people don't have the resources to do that. So a lot of it goes largely unenforced because the only way to enforce it most of the time is through the court
I mean, a
system.
lot of the protections are through litigation, and here's where I'll give you the full name of Matt's. He's the clinical director of the Disability Inclusion and Advocacy Law Clinic. That's DIAL, at Nova University's Shepherd Broad College of Law. Okay, I mean that just took me 5 minutes to say all that, but he's a wonderful. He does a lot for the community for disabled individuals. Let's talk about the ADA for a minute. After more than 30 years, what do you view as the most persistent or frustrating loophole or enforcement challenge with the ADA?
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, and it's just enforcement, I would say,
Yeah.
across the board because half, and it's not just in Florida, like this is across the country. Most US cities are still not fully in compliance. Like, they're like 50% in compliance. A lot of stores aren't in compliance. And the ADA was meant to be the floor, not the ceiling, but we're still down in the basement and not even reaching the floor yet. So, enforcement has been a big issue, and it's really kind of kept this law that was meant to fully integrate disabled people into their communities. It's really kind of inhibited its full intention. And even after the ADA was passed, it went through a few Supreme Court challenges
Mm-hmm.
and amended, and so, and I just completely lost my train of thought with that.
Well, if you think about it, that's fine. Or if it pops back up in your head, that's fine. It happens to me all the time now that I'm, I'll ageism myself here. But the Capitol, we've talked about. You're telling me you went through with they audited it, or I don't know. The Capitol seems to me to be such an unaccommodating place, and I was griping about little things that I encountered a couple of years ago, but I was wondering what if you could rate the Capitol on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you say? And do you think that we're doing a good job of implementing the ADA in that building, the capital of the third largest state in the nation, I might say?
Um, I don't know that I'd give it an F. I can at least get around the Capitol okay. It's when I want to get into a member's office that is full of, 15 sofas for some reason, that there isn't room for me to be able to do that. The
Huh.
committee doors are way too heavy. You've been there. We don't
Yeah.
all just sit in a committee through the entire thing. You're bouncing back and forth. So if the sergeants aren't there to hold the door open,
Right.
having to pull on this really heavy door, that doesn't meet requirements. Some of the committee rooms don't even have a place for me to be able to park my chair.
Right.
And if you have more than two people in a wheelchair, there's nowhere for people to go in those. As you mentioned, parking is a problem. One of my biggest gripes is the new elevators. They're
Oh.
awful. I hate those
Oh
things
my gosh.
so
Yes,
much.
because you have to hit the pad. There's no button inside, there's a pad. Half the time, by the time it comes, you don't know it's opened and closed by the time you got there, right? So,
There is a button that you can push that is intended for people who are, blind. It does like a different chime. For people in wheelchairs and mobility issues, it's supposed to open the elevator closest to you or one of
oh,
those
really?
right in front of you. However, and it works when the Capitol is not
Oh,
full,
God.
but when you're in session and there
Yeah.
are multiple elevators opening on, the second floor,
Yeah.
I found this out by accident, and I don't know that the people in the elevator knew that was me, thankfully. But I kept hitting the button, going, I need, and none of the elevators in front of me. But what I realized is like every time I hit the floor that I wanted, it was holding another elevator hostage. That was on the other side, and the doors kept
Oh,
opening. They're like, what's happening? And I'm like, oh, so this doesn't work when the Capitol's busy, and the chimes can't be heard, and there's not a whole lot of distinction between them. They sound very familiar. And it'll tell you, go to elevator D. Well, if you're blind, which one's elevator D?
right.
Like, how is that helpful?
Right.
So those things, yeah, they were a
Well,
nightmare
we
in
all hate the
that sense.
elevators, abled people as well. I don't think there's anybody who really is in love with them. So that's interesting. I've got a couple of fun questions that I usually ask all my folks. I'm just going to ask it. Crocs, yay or nay?
Nay.
Okay. Pumpkin spice, yay or nay?
Oh, yay. I am a complete and total, white girl spiced pumpkin.
That
As soon
is
as that
so
is out
funny.
at Starbucks, that is my go-to.
That
So
is
yeah.
so funny because people feel very strongly. They're either hell yes or hell no on pumpkin spice. I'm a hell no. Your favorite app on your phone?
Oof. Favorite? I don't know if I have a favorite. I mean, there's the most frequently used, but I've come to a point where I just like hate my phone generally. My husband asked me where I wanted to do for my birthday, and it was basically I want to go somewhere where people cannot reach me.
There you go.
But probably actually iBooks, so I can
iBooks.
read on my phone.
Yeah, that's good. I had somebody on recently and she said Libby, which is the one you can from the library. You can get the free books, and I don't know if you've ever used that, but you get free digital books and also audiobooks from the library. Check it out. You're a Tallahassee person. You can do that. What's your favorite Tallahassee restaurant?
We frequent Canopy Road, but Midtown Caboose is definitely up there. So I think those are probably our two favorites that are tied.
Okay, great. Well, Olivia Keller, thank you I hope we could get together IRL. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you. Thank you for the attention that you gave to this. I was kind of screaming into the ether before I filed the litigation and just trying to get people to pay attention and the harm that it was doing. And then you covered it with your story and it just exploded and suddenly it was everywhere. And I've had news channels calling me to do interviews. I don't necessarily like being in the spotlight, but I'm very glad that the litigation itself, just because of the impact this has on people, is getting the attention. And I feel like, I have hit the pinnacle of my career in getting both a Dara article and the podcast.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been a treat.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida, hosted by News Service senior writer Dara Cam and produced by me, Mike Exline. Music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs, LLC.